My husband Andrew Hine and I have owned Elmore Mountain Bread for, I believe, 16 years now. We're a wood-fired bakery in Elmore, Vermont. We are also a wholesale bakery where we sell to local farm stands, or our accounts range from restaurants to farm stands to CSAs to specialty food shops to local gas stations to large supermarkets in our area. So we have a really diverse range of where we sell our product to be able to get our bread into all different kinds of people's mouths and diets and tables. We are also a stone ground flour mill. So we purchase, one of our main goals for the bakery is to work directly with local organic grain farmers here in Vermont, and we source all of our grain, 100% of our wheat, rye, and other cereals directly from farmers here in north central Vermont. And we have a stone mill on site, and we mill all of our flour the day before it goes into the mixing bowl. Every speck of flour that we use, from the flour that we dust the couches with to everything in the breads, is milled on site. A local cafe, and I was buying baguettes from a baker who was making like 150 loaves of bread a week, and he came in and asked me if I knew anybody that wanted to buy a house, 10 acres, and a wood-fired bakery. At the time, I had no intention of doing that, but I was really curious about where the bread came from, so I came and visited the bakery. And I was just enchanted. I really knew nothing about baking, but there was this guy needed to sell to the business and get out of there, and there was something about it that just caught Andrew and I. And so before we knew it, we had bought this house and this land and this wood-fired bakery. And so there was this little Allen Scott 5x7 Allen Scott oven that we inherited in the bakery, and the baker that we were working with was buying King Arthur flour, and so that's kind of how we learned, was kind of just repeating what he was doing, because we were walking into a pre-established client base in our community. We were able to just kind of step in and carry on. After about 6 years, our Allen Scott oven, we kind of kept growing and growing the bakery, and the Allen Scott oven started to fail. Basically, the sub hearth underneath collapsed, and so we knew really quickly that we were going to have to rebuild the oven. So we started researching ovens, and this basically brings us around to why we mill flour in our transition from using flour purchased elsewhere through a distributor and from different mills to milling our own. But we realized that we needed to build another wood-fired oven, and so we started researching different styles of ovens and what to do, and that really led us to connecting with the broader baking community as we were doing this research, because we're fairly isolated here in Elmore, Vermont. It's a small town, and we're at a small bakery at the end of a dirt road, and so it was really amazing to start connecting with these other bakers, and through designing and learning about these other wood-fired ovens that were around the country and around the world, we also naturally went visiting and creating these connections with other bakers, started to learn more about their process and what they were doing in their individual bakeries. And so through that, and connecting with these bakers, there were a couple of them, namely David Bauer at Farm and Sparrow down in Asheville, North Carolina, who ended up building a second version of our wood-fired oven. He was one of the few bakers at the time milling his own flour, and he really captivated us in his stories about the difference between roller milled flour and stone ground flour, and the not just the building the relationships with the farmers and being able to communicate that with the family, with your community, but also really demonstrating to us and explaining to us the nutritional benefits of using stone ground flour. And more than that, for me as a baker who had, just kind of been buying white flour, we'd switched actually to Milanese Mignery around that time, amazing family-owned mill in Quebec. So we were using their flour by then, but I was using the fermentation skills that I developed by owning the bakery to develop flavor. And what I was learning through these relationships and talking with these other bakers was that by using fresh milled flour, I could be using those fermentation skills that I learned to enhance the inherent aromas that are in the grains, the individual grains, to build the flavor in the breads instead of using just, trying to build flavor through fermentation straight in those breads. So David basically sent me a box of different flours that he had milled and overnighted them to us, and I opened them up and they all had different aromas and different colors and different textures, and it totally intrigued us. And so that's how we kind of got to the idea of stone fresh milled flour as opposed to buying in flour in the bakery as we had been. I do get a lot of feedback from my customers, which is one of the beautiful things about doing my own deliveries and maintaining a connection with them on a daily basis. And I think as we've moved to using local grains, and one of the things that I've really worked the hardest at is being able to tell the story and to communicate the story to our customers about why we do what we do. Why do we why do we have a wood-fired oven? Why do we choose to go to this greater extent to burn firewood instead of just having a regular electric or gas oven? Why do we utilize these local grains? And so what we found to do is, for every loaf of bread we have, instead of buying all the grains from our farmers and blending them, we mill them by farm and by variety, and depending on the year and the quality of the grain and what our relationship is with the farmers, we build the breads to tell the story of the farms. And so what we're doing, the sole purpose in that is to be able to communicate that to our customers and have them think about what they're eating. And because think about it, I always think of, to kind of steal the phrase from Amy Halloran, that local grains the last frontier of the local food movement. So people will, when I watch them, and myself going to the grocery store, I care about my dairy and my cheese and my coffee and where my chocolate comes from and all of these things. But that awareness, as we know, is not necessarily found when in people's vernacular when they're looking for breads. And so what I try and do is tell the story. And because we're such a small and local business, people know where these towns are and where these farms are, and they know these farmers, and they know that Vermont is struggling with our dairy industry, and they know that Vermont farms are having a hard time. And by creating this awareness and this conversation and saying, hey, they're also growing grains, and they're selling grains to bakeries and coffee shops and all of these different avenues of dispersing the grains, it's giving the farmers another way to support their farms. And in the state of Vermont, our main source of income is that we're an agricultural state. So our agricultural landscape is really, really important, but it's changing. And so incorporating grains and cereals into their farm plans is really helping build up these farms that are struggling. And so it's really an amazing thing to be able to communicate that to the customers and get them excited, because these are all tangible things that they're seeing and hearing and that's happening to their grandfather's farm or their uncle's farm or their neighbor's farm. And it's like, oh, there's something else these people can be doing on their farms to kind of bring money in. And at the same time, Vermont is such an amazing food state as far as the awareness goes for how people source their food and what they look for and awareness. And so it's really easy to get people excited and to back this and to create a demand across the state to be able to, actually make this into a viable endeavor. Thinking about what bread used to be and what bread is now in the way that I think about the bread that I want to make, one of the most important factors that I always hold on to as we make these decisions about what our bread is going to look like or what is the bakery producing, is keeping tradition, always keeping that history and tradition in our minds. So we're thinking about stone milling, right? The way that flour has been produced for, ages and ages. Thinking about wood-fired ovens, thinking about long fermentation, thinking about naturally leavened breads, and thinking about that process. But what I try and do is do it in a way that has modern sensibilities to it. So even though I'm using a wood-fired oven, a black oven, which is a directly fired, the fire's on the hearth of the oven, and the heat is just saturated into the masonry, and there's no fire left whenever I'm baking the bread. All the bread is baked on retained heat. I mean, it's the simplest form of an oven. It's like a brick box, put fire in, cool it, put bread in, take bread out. But I do it in a way to be able to, I designed an oven that would allow me to be able to bake bread with the aesthetics that I want. I want steam, I want open crumb, I want crisp, crisp mouthfeel, I want deep color, I want all of these aesthetic things, 'cause we eat with our eyes first, right? And there's a certain, just picture of what I would want the bread to look like. And so Andrew and I have been able to develop tools keeping these traditional methods of baking bread in mind, but creating tools that allow us to be able to make the modern bread that we feel like we want to eat. And everybody always asks me why we don't grow the bakery or open a retail spot in town or change it and make it bigger and grow and do more. And I'm like, my answer is really simple, and it goes right back to that question, is it's because I love what I do and I don't want to do anything else. And by keeping it in its own right, it's a selfish act, because I want to keep doing the parts and the whole process, and I love every piece of the product from start to finish, from milling the grain, actually further back than that, from becoming friends and developing these relationships with the farmers we work with, to milling the grain, to working with my friend I source all my firewood from 3 miles down the road, building these relationships and then bringing them back into here and applying them and being able to be part of that entire process. I love every single step of the way. So when people do ask me, well, you should move to town, you should change the bakery, you should grow, I'm like, no, because then I wouldn't be doing what I love anymore. And so it's a very simple answer for me to give in that sense. So the approachable loaf concept is a project born out of the Washington State University Bread Lab, and it was brought to my awareness by Steve Jones, and the conversation starting, I believe the first time I heard about it was at a grain gathering. I don't recall how many years ago. But for me, and my involvement and why I was so excited about this project is there's many different streams of excitement for me. At the time when right before the conversation about the approachable loaf happened, my son was in grade school, and he happened to go to the last one-room schoolhouse in the state of Vermont. It's a public school, but it's a one-room schoolhouse, so 1st through 3rd grade. And all the kids are together, and once a week, each family was invited to go into the classroom and have lunch with the students. And I went to do the lunch, and I looked around, and I'd heard whisperings from Phineas, my son, that kids kind of made fun of him, that he ate his sandwiches on like really dark bread, and all the kids had, white square bread for their sandwiches, and he kind of felt some insecurity around it too. And sometimes I almost feel like he wanted to ask if he could like have different bread. So going into this school and looking around at the 15 kids in his class, and I was like, the only kid in this classroom who's eating our bread for lunch is my kid. Now their parents all buy the bread for their dinners or for parties and for their consumption, but the kids weren't eating it in their lunch. And I was basically faced with this thought that was like, I'm doing this all wrong. Like, what am I doing? Like, nothing I'm doing matters if these kids aren't eating the bread. And so basically what I started doing was asking all the moms at the schoolyard, like, when do you do your school shopping or shopping for your school lunches? And I just did this like formal poll. Like, they thought it was such a weirdo. They're like, why do you care about when I do my grocery shopping? Whatever. Turns out most of them do the shopping for the week around 11:30 on Sunday mornings at Hannaford's, which is our local big grocery store. Now, I'm lucky enough to sell our bread at this grocery store. It's the only big store that we sell at, but they give me my own 2 freestanding racks. I come in, I bring the bread in I guess with the approachable loaf, I bring it in 4 days a week because I bring our hearth breads 2 days, the approachable loaf 2 days a week. And so that was where they do their shopping. And I was like, this is very interesting. So what if I started taking our Vermont Redeemer bread, which is a single variety of wheat from one farm, and I bought strap pans and I do a pan bread. And that coincided directly with when this conversation about the approachable bread was starting at the bread lab. So it was like, it just all made sense, and this was already on my mind. And so that's kind of how we got involved with it. I bake the approachable loaf 2 times a week. So I bake in general Tuesday and Friday, and I also do the approachable bread. And so I deliver them on Tuesday and Friday to Hannaford's, to this massive grocery store. And I always said there were 2 things I would never do. I would never slice bread, and I would never put it in plastic. And I do both of those things, and it is glorious because the kids now have their sandwiches on this very specific loaf of bread that is designed, to be able to, access a whole demographic of people who perhaps were not buying the crusty baguettes and the dark country loaves. And so for me to see that happen is really important. And of course, 10 cents of every loaf of that bread is donated to the Bread Lab and the incredible work they do. And so for me to be able to give back to them for all of the work they've done that facilitates the work I'm able to do with farmers and growing grains that work for our changing climates and for their growing systems, and down to riverbed soil, to these are all conversations that we have, and these are all things that I'm aware of, and it's largely because of the work that Bread Lab does. Thing that I see about buying my wheat and my grains from local farmers is because there is a gap there. What am I trying to say? There's a disconnect and between consumers and the farmers, and the consumers don't understand what goes into it and what the risk that they take every year putting these grains in, and particularly for small farmers, like here in Vermont with our farmers, we're talking like they're maybe planting 40 acres. That's like a sizable, that's average 40, 2 to 3 20-acre parcels of land. So we're talking really small scale, and the amount of effort and planning and all of these things that go into it is not being acknowledged and just isn't known by the consumer. So when people are thinking about the bread that they're buying and the price they're paying and the grains they're eating, there's a total disconnect. And again, with thinking about when dairy and meat and coffee and all of these other things, there's an appreciation for that process and variety and origin and such. And that's really exciting, and it's incredible that people are looking at food that way. But it's something that disconnect exists with grains. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is with the bread on my end and with the mills on Andrew's end is to hopefully, create some story and some connection and trying to rebuild that relationship and awareness between consumer and producer of these grains. When thinking about rotations for the farmers, I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about that, and it was particularly brought to my mind last Friday. I was up at University of Vermont's Crop and Fields Day up at Borderview Farm in Alberg. And what that is, it's where Heather Darby from the UVM Extension Service does all of her trials of different cereals and sunflowers and hemp, and does all of her work. And one of the pieces of conversation was about rotation and cover cropping, and how aware people are of cover cropping now, and thinking about what those covers are, and then thinking about rotation. One of the farmers I work with, Seth Johnson, one of his major sources of income, besides growing grain, is dry beans. And he has probably the most extraordinary organic dry beans that I've ever eaten in my life. And that's a huge part of his system on his farm, and it's really, really vital to the sustainability of it, and for soil health and everything that goes into producing these different crops yearly and generating income. So I make a variety of different breads, but they're all made exclusively with organic stone-milled Vermont grain. I base the breads around what grains are available to me each year after the harvest. So some years there's more single variety breads, and then some years there's less, depending on how the growing season went. I make a baguette, a country bread, and then, which are kind of just the two sort of unnamed varieties of wheat, and that's a blend of all the different wheats and rye that we purchase. And then from there I make different smaller loaves that are based on the variety of grain. One of the best things, I would say that one of the only reasons why Andrew and I have been able to get to the point where we're baking the bread that we want to be baking in the way that we want to be baking, with the level of attention to process, is purely inspired by our relationships and friendships with other bakers. And the baking community is extraordinary in that everybody shares so much information, and everybody visits each other, and everybody inspires each other, and everybody helps each other, and learning how to use fresh milled grains. There's no closed, there's no secrecy, because we're all working towards the same thing, which is making better bread for our communities and for our customers. And so by sharing that information and that knowledge, it's only helping shift that paradigm. So the more bread that is better made with these things in mind, it's better for all of us. And so the community is really helpful in that sense, and I've just been able to pull so much information and inspiration and friendships and all of those things from that.